So we're going to focus in on the politics of agenda setting, which is very important to understanding how democracy works in the United States. In a fully functioning democracy, it should be the people through elections that send signals to their public officials as to the problems that should be addressed. And if that's what actually happens, kind of in the political systems theory model, where the inputs equal the outputs, then democracy is working well. If somebody else has the ability to be able to make and set the agenda, then that is obviously to the detriment of democracy. So we're going to focus on why government looks at some policies and not others. So let's just go back to James Anderson's categorization of the policy agenda. Anderson says that the policy agenda is the demands that policymakers choose to or feel compelled to act on, or at least appear to be acting on. And I think the second part of that is very important, that it's at least appear to be acting on, right? So these are the things that government's actually looking at any given moment in time, and what they are studying and what they're trying to do. So there are potentially thousands of different things that they could be looking at, but there are only a few items at any given point in time that are actually on the public agenda, right? Essentially because there's a limited amount of time and there are a limited amount of resources to be able to function. Now, Cobb and Elder, who are probably the two most well-known theorists of studying policy agendas, basically point to two different things, what we can call a systemic agenda versus what we can call the governmental agenda. So the systemic agendas are essentially everything that's being discussed in the Washington community. Interest groups, politicians, the media, members of Congress. What are the issues that are out there that are being discussed? Now, obviously, there's an infinite amount of possibilities that are on the systemic agenda. So really, that doesn't provide a very useful context for us to understand how government works. What we really want to focus in on is the governmental agenda. What's government actually attending to at any given point in time? Now, in looking at that, Cobb and Elder break down two additional things within the governmental agenda. One is the mandatory agenda items, and second are discretionary agenda items. So, for example, in the federal government, the federal budget year, what they call the fiscal year, runs from October 1st to September 30th. Technically, in any given year, the budget has to be passed by September 30th in order for it to start on October 1st, and absent a budget, the federal government cannot operate. Hence, over the last several years, we've had threats of government shutdowns and actual government shutdowns. Without legislation, the government cannot run. So that obviously is, as a consequence, a mandatory public policy that has to be on the agenda. We have it at the state level as well, but over the last several years, we have not been able to get that done on time either. Presidential appointments are something that are kind of mandatory. So when the president, say for example, President Trump became president, all of his cabinet had to be vetted by the United States Senate, and then have a confirmation process. That would be something we consider to be mandatory. The president negotiates a treaty with another country. That's something that has to be looked at by them. We also have what are called reauthorizations, which are every several years major public policy topics have to be reauthorized. Essentially, we re-up for another 4 or 5 years and say, these are our priorities in agriculture for the next 4 or 5 years, and this is how much money we want to spend. So once money runs dry or runs out on a certain program, that has to be reauthorized, and that's mandatory, or else you can't spend money on that program. Then there are also discretionary things. So, for example, every president comes into office with some issues that they got elected on and which don't necessarily have to be dealt with, but are important to them. So President Obama, for example, when he became president, focused his first year plus, about a year and a quarter, on passing the Affordable Care Act. That was a discretionary item. He could have decided to focus more on economic development, particularly because of the recession, but he felt as though he would never have enough political capital again to be able to push health care through, and the time was then to do that. That was a discretionary policy. Republicans in Congress attempting to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. That is a discretionary policy. There already is a policy called the Affordable Care Act. The Republicans have put this on the agenda as a discretionary item. There's no mandatory reason for that to be discussed. So really we want to focus in on the governmental agenda and not the systemic agenda. Now, in looking at how we set the agenda, there are a couple of different ways to focus on this. John Kingdon has an agenda setting model that's very well known and very useful to helping us understand when things actually get passed. And you'll see a diagram here. His agenda setting model says that there are basically three streams out there. There's a problem stream, a policy stream, a politics stream, and then there's a policy window. When all three of these streams can come together, you got a pretty good likelihood that something's actually going to pass. If not, if those streams don't come together, probably will not pass. So let's take a look at what each one of these individual things mean. The problem stream. One of the things that we focus on is how do problems gain the attention of members of government or the public. There are a number of things that Kingdon points to. He talks about indicators, focusing events, and feedback. So there are a lot of government statistics or statistics that are provided that are indicators to us of when there is a problem. The biggest thing, obviously, is unemployment. Right? When the unemployment rate starts to increase, generally we are in a recession. Our economic growth is another indicator, and that indicates to us that a priority should be placed on finding new ways to create jobs. Rates of poverty and impoverishment are indicators that let us know what needs to be dealt with in society. The cost of government programs, other indicators. Looking at budget deficits over time are indicators of the health of the economy and the health of the federal budget, and are an indicator that something needs to be done. Right? So if we see an exploding future budget deficit, that usually is an indicator, at least to Republicans, that they should try to cut some spending. Sometimes you have what's called a focusing event, which really places great emphasis on something that's occurring and the need to be able to make policy change on that. So for example, within our lifetimes, probably the biggest focusing event was September 11th, 2001. Prior to that point in time, most people had never heard of Al-Qaeda. Most people were not particularly concerned about terrorism, but that event then changed the way that we looked at the world, the United States' place in the world, and within a matter of 2 years, we were in two separate wars, one in Afghanistan and one in Iraq, and that was a focusing event that changed the trajectory of American foreign policy. A couple of other things. Hurricane Katrina was a focusing event on our global warming and our ability to be able to deal with disasters, and certainly FEMA became a household name after that, and we've suffered through a number of hurricanes recently, and really our ability to be able to limit the loss of lives probably was a consequence of Katrina being a focusing event that changed the way that we deal with disasters. There are all kinds of things in relationship to this that we can talk about focusing events. And then finally, feedback. One thing is that citizens and state governments and local governments and institutions and businesses provide feedback to government when programs don't work. And that creates a need to be able to alter or change these policies, and that brings it to the attention of government. Right? So indicators being some kind of statistics that alert us to a problem, a focusing event, something that gains widespread notoriety, and then puts something on the agenda, and then finally kind of this idea of feedback on how policies work. The second stream that we talk about with Kingdon is the politics stream. And these are things that politicians perceive should actually be addressed. And this changes over time, and there are a number of reasons why. One is that one political party or the other believes that there might be an electoral advantage to dealing with this problem. So just use the example of the Republicans attempting to get rid of the Affordable Care Act, repeal and replace because they think that that is a policy that's got them elected over the last election cycles, and that's something that they should be focusing on, right? So that's the politics stream. Oftentimes when we get a new president, they come in with what they consider to be a mandate to change policy and a small amount of items that they ran on. So for example, for Donald Trump, immigration's a major issue that is on his agenda. In addition to that, renegotiating NAFTA. So there are all these kind of things that happen when you have a new president or a new congressional majority that takes over. There can also be times in which there's just a change in the national mood, that we believe that certain things should be dealt with. So there's a lot of discussion in American culture today about income inequality, and people are more willing than they probably have been in several decades to regulate businesses and become more kind of intrusive in the business environment. And that's because people's ideas about what's fair and what's not fair in the topic of inequality is grown to gain attention. Finally, interest groups can also press their demands and get things on the agenda, but as it says down here at the bottom, interest groups are generally much better at blocking ideas than they are actually getting things onto the agenda. So really, the national mood and elections and rational behavior by politicians are the most important things in the policy stream. In the politics stream. And then finally, we have the policy stream, and that is what should be done about a problem. So the interesting thing about the policy streams are that there are all types of ideas that are floating around out there about policy issues. What you try to do if you have a solution to a problem is attach it to a problem that's existing at the current time, right? So every issue that's out there that you're supporting has a proposal that you've developed about how to deal with it, and you're always trying to find somebody that will pass that policy. So for example, you can use different focusing events for different purposes, right? So say for example, the hurricanes that just came through Florida and Texas, they can be used for the purposes of trying to deal with things like global climate change, or they can be used as a method to be able to focus in on how to deal more effectively with disaster relief. Now, all the proposals for dealing with climate change or disaster relief are already out there. What I'm trying to do is take my proposal for that and attach it to some event that's occurring. So you're successful if you match policies to events. Then finally, we have these policy windows. There are times in which you have to strike while the iron is hot. And I mentioned that President Obama in 2009, 2010 felt that the only time that he could pass health care reform would be in his first year or so of office. And after that, you'd run into the midterm elections, and then he'd be up for the next presidential election in 2012. So there was a small policy window to be able to pass health care legislation, and he didn't want to miss that window. So basically that's driven by the problem stream and the political stream. So, things gain people's attentions, and then at that point in time, our politicians say, oh, we should deal with this problem. But the window for passing policy change can close relatively quickly. So you have a very limited time period. Now, the question is, why does that policy window close so quickly? And Anthony Downs, who's an economist or a political economist, basically has said that there's an issue attention cycle. And there are certain stages that we go through that open a window for policy enactment and then close it very quickly. So there's the pre-problem stage when nobody except for the people that are really affected by a policy are interested in it. It's out of the public view. There isn't much being discussed by the public. Then there's what we can call the alarm discovery stage. All of a sudden a problem pops up there and people get all excited about this issue and we should be addressing this, right? And then interest groups, politicians, people that oppose that policy start to say, hey, wait a second, yeah, it would be real nice if we had that policy, but there are a lot of costs associated with that. And you can't see it right here, but I will make these slides available to you. You can click on the Harry and Louise video here. Back in 1992, when President Clinton, actually 93, when President Clinton was trying to pass health care reform, it was on the public docket and people were generally receptive to health care reform. But then a series of ads, and it's very rare that kind of ads really change things, but a series of ads called the Harry and Louise ads ran and basically said, hey, I was for all this, but look at all this government regulation. Look at the fact that my health care is going to change. And people started to realize, well, yeah, we want to insure the uninsured, but we don't want our health care to change. And we realized that there's going to be a cost with a project and with a policy, and gradually this leads to a decline of our intensity of interest, and next thing you know, you get to the post-problem stage where once again something is out of view and nobody deals with it except for the experts. So that's kind of an overview of John Kingdon's idea of how things get onto the agenda. So there are these streams that move around there. When you can get the streams together and fit them through a policy window, you've got a good chance of passing policy. But as you can see from this, this is a real reason why there is very rarely any massive reform that goes on in government.